You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your weighing my options host, Abraham.
And I'm your prime choice host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do and animals do and why they do them, and sometimes how we describe those things quantitatively using math. And yeah, so thank you for joining us. If you're here with us for the first time, we appreciate you being here. If you enjoy what you hear today, consider liking and subscribing, leaving a rating and review, joining us on Patreon, head over to our website, tell some friends, all the cool stuff. But if you're listening to this on the day that it publishes, I'd like to wish you a happy backwards day.
Yeah. It's a backwards day, apparently.
It's backwards day.
Which is different than opposite day, from what I understand.
It's also not the same as backwards bay.
Oh, man. See, that's a spoonerism day.
Yeah, that's different.
They're all different. It's also appreciate your social security check day.
Okay.
So I feel like that's a fairly unique American experience.
Yeah, in like 15 years, no one will even know what that means.
Right? Ooh.
It's also Gorilla Suit Day, so bust out your gorilla suit.
Yeah. It's also Eat Brussels Sprouts Day, which I am a big fan of. I like that.
Absolutely. Hell is Freezing Over Day, so okay.
All right. It's also Hug an Economist Day. I don't know that I need to.
Yeah. It is Inspire Your Heart with Art Day, which is what it sounds like. Do art.
I like that.
Look at art. Buy art from artists.
Yeah, especially local artists. Support them.
Yeah.
It's also National Hot Chocolate Day, which I think Abraham needs one right now.
I do. I need a hot chocolate filled with coffee. Just you can hold the chocolate.
I think that's a mocha.
Yeah, I do love mochas. No, I love chocolate. I just need the coffee. It is Scotch Tape Day.
Yep, it is. It's also Cordova Iceworm Days. So it's like a Cordova Iceworm Week.
Oh, I remember this. I remember talking about this like a year ago.
Yeah. It's so weird.
It's International Hot Air Balloon Week.
Yeah, where it's more temperate, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I feel like, at least in our part of the world, this is not the week to do that sort of thing. But
no, I think it's fine here.
In my part of the world.
In my part of the world, I think you're okay. I think it's probably pretty nice to do it.
Sure.
It's National Cowboy Poetry Gathering Week, which sounds like so many things coming together. And I want to watch that. I want to see what happens there.
I don't know if you know this, but Elko, Nevada, this rural town in northeastern Nevada, hosts cowboy poetry, and it is like a national event. A lot of people go there to this thing.
That actually sounds really wholesome.
Feel free to stop by. I will wish you good tidings in your journey.
I appreciate that.
It is U.S. Snow Sculpting Week.
Yeah, I mean, not here.
That does make sense with my part of the world. Okay, anyway, we're actually we're not a podcast that just talks about days of the week. That would be a short podcast, and there's only 7 of them. Although there's lots of things to talk about with those 7, sure. Anyway, as I said, we're actually talking about psychology things. In this particular instance, we're going to get down into the nerdiest of nerdy math things. So trigger warning for those of you for whom math is not your forte. We are not going to ask you to do math. We're barely going to ask you to think about math, but we are going to be talking a lot about how people use math in a very specific way.
Yes. As somebody who is math diverse, I approve this episode.
Okay.
So I think we'll be okay.
Okay, that's very helpful that you can weigh in with your experience here.
Yeah, I got it covered.
We do have 3 real stories to help couch this narrative into the real human experience. And these are real, that they have all happened to a real person at some point. Story 1, a person brings their groceries to the checkout counter. They receive the total due for their groceries. They pay for their groceries and they leave. That is a thing that has happened. It is a real story.
Yes. Another real story is that a neurodiverse person who never developed a comprehensive ability to speak or understand language digs feces out of the toilet and throws it at a nearby caregiver or support staff. That does happen.
That does happen. That has happened. Story 3. A person starts gambling and gets so hooked that they spend all of their savings to continue their gambling habit. One day, they sold their jewelry and their dishes just to get more money to fuel their gambling habit.
Yes. So all 3 of these scenarios that we just talked about, these people were in a situation and they did some particular thing. In which of these scenarios was someone making a choice one of them, all of them, none of them. But we've got to start kind of looking at that perspective of like, which scenario was the choice scenario?
Yeah, what is choosing? How and why do we do it? And so this is a discussion in part about making choices and why people make choices and how we understand the choices that they make. But it's also, and this is directly linked to choices, a primer on the idea of the matching law inside of behaviorism, behavior analysis. That specifically, choice more broadly. So general category choice, specific thing that we're talking about inside of that is the matching law and understanding what that means and what it is. If you're new to behavior analysis, or maybe you're totally tangential and have never heard of behavior analysis or behaviorism or whatever, and you're just here for the psychology kicks, that's cool. I think that this is something that anybody can grasp onto and understand what it's proposing to say.
Yeah, and so to go on record, we want to make sure, and I'm gonna be the buffer on this.
Okay.
Now, Abraham is going to be as nice as possible and is trying to be nice. You may see some leakage here, though.
I'm going to try. I also want to invite you, Shane, to both hold me accountable to that and also feel free to challenge me on my arguments here, because I took the lead on preparing the discussion for this and jotting down notes and outlining our ideas here. Mm-hmm. And I also understand that I sometimes live in an echo chamber of my own making, of my own world, where I just sort of talk to myself and then agree with the things that I've said, and that I'm not always right. And a lot of people point out, like, no, how about this thing? I'm like, oh, I never thought about that. And so I prefer to be challenged, but I have outlined my ideas around this thing now so that we can have this discussion, get it out there, and then, get back to me. Let me know what you think. Maybe I got it wrong. But yeah.
I also really appreciate that you talked about being in an echo chamber while you're sitting in a room full of padding to prevent echoes from happening.
This is true. I have tried to reduce the echoes, and we'll see how well it works.
I just use books for mine. I just use books to block the echo of mine. So like, there's just so much paper in my room right now. I'm pretty sure it's a fire hazard.
Yes. Although Florida, not maybe as much as other places.
We call it wet fires here.
Wet fires. Yeah. They're at risk of being moist books.
Sure.
All right. Let's get into some of the background on our topic here. In 1938, B.F. Skinner, famous behavioral scientist, arguably the progenitor of behavior science more generally, although there were people who preceded him, but he really kicked this off. In 1938, he published a book called The Behavior of Organisms, which I always assumed this was a reference to Darwin's On the Origin of Species, although I realize the only thing they have in common is the word on.
Sure.
and of. Actually, no, they don't have on. It's just of. That's pretty much it. Anyway, it was the cadence of it felt similar. I could be wrong, but I just assumed it had some reference to that. I don't know. In this book he published, The Behavior of Organisms, he recounts many experiments, largely with rats, to understand how and why they learn to perform specific types of actions when they receive food rewards.
Right, and so this eventually spawned an entire field inside of psychology, several journals, unaccountable research strands.
Uncountable.
I'm sorry, not unaccountable. They are very accountable. Let's be clear. They are uncountable research strands and thousands of careers, all based on operant learning theory. So this was kind of like the face that launched 1,000 ships, right? This was the Helen of Troy of behavioral science.
There we go. Okay. And at the risk of being reductionist, because we're going to sort of gloss over the fine details here, I want to miss important detail and nuance. Let's briefly describe how Skinner studied learning. In Skinner's experiments, he arranged a situation in which these rats were in a cage with a lever that they could press.
Despite all their rage.
Yes.
I had to.
I couldn't. I set it up. It's fair.
So there are a sequence of steps in which the observer, Skinner, or maybe a hapless grad student, whoever the observer was, they would release strategically timed food rewards. The rat would eventually approach, touch, and eventually press the lever. And this shaping of their behavior toward a specific target in this case was they were shaping towards pressing a lever specifically. So they were actually kind of leading the rat to learn how to press the lever. Then the food they earned would be automatically distributed at a predetermined interval or responses of pressing the lever depending on how they arrange the experiment.
All right, very good. So to be clear, because we want to make sure we're really understanding the arrangement of this situation here. You have the rats are in a cage, despite their rage. They're just being rats, and they eventually learn that certain movements, orientations, or actions will reliably produce food. Okay.
Sure.
So most of the time that they're in these cages, they're kept on a calorie restricted diet so that they would be highly motivated to earn that food. And so they're usually a little hungry, we assume. Right. Then the food would be made available to them if and only if they performed a certain action, in this case, pressing the lever, as we've been discussing.
Right. And they tried experiments such as putting a light in the room and food was only available for the lever press if the light was illuminated, and saw that the rat would come to learn the light signaled the availability of food and would only press if the light was on. So there are these kinds of things, these different variations of the experiment that have really expanded from this original press the lever, get food.
And we do need to kind of put a pin in that idea of what the light signals there, because that will come back a little bit later when we're talking about understanding behavior shaping in these situations. Okay.
Right.
So they were motivated because they were hungry. There was a lever. There was food available for pressing the lever. That's just a brief synopsis of essentially what was going on in these cages. Now, if you wanted to, you could say that every time that the rat pressed the lever, they chose to press the lever.
Sure.
They could have done anything else, but they made the choice to press the lever. Why? Because they were hungry. It was available. They earned food by doing so, as I just said. Okay, so why not frame this then as a choice instead of just talking about the fact that they did it? Why frame it as a choice?
Well, I don't think we need to. So saying that they made a choice implies to some extent that they were saying the independent variable, which is the cause, or that we are saying the independent variable, which is the cause, or at least an independent variable is their choice making. So choice making in itself is the IV, and an oversimplified but very useful framework for thinking of this kind of ABC, always be closing. Wait, I meant antecedent behavior consequence. So if we start looking at it from that paradigm, antecedent being what happened before, the behavior itself is B, and then consequence or what happens after is C, we can kind of look at it from that perspective. And in choosing, you would need an extra B, or maybe a separate A. So this becomes a unique challenge. So let's kind of map this out. Antecedent, the lever's present and they are hungry, right? So that's kind of what we see there. That's the antecedent.
Okay, good beginning.
B, they choose to press the lever, but B2 is they press the lever. So choosing to press the lever and pressing the lever are both behaviors in this kind of context. And then C, they receive the food. So that's a kind of an easy way to simplify, or that's a simplified way of looking at that particular context.
Yeah, it's a useful heuristic for understanding the sequence of things that are related to a behavior that occurs. Okay, so we added and we sort of shoehorned in this B there. It's maybe an antecedent, maybe a behavior. It seems to be on the behavior side since it's something an organism's doing. Anyway, if we take choice out of the equation, the orderly and predictable sequence of events is not changed. It's not more mysterious by the fact that we are not saying that they made a choice. Said another way, adding the concept that they chose to press the lever adds nothing but confusion and fantasy to our understanding of their behavior, because we now have to try and insert some other thing and relate it to the things that we can directly observe and presumably assume that it plays some causal role in their behavior.
Right, because I think at the end of the day, what's really helpful too for those folks that are listening is that choice is something that an organism does, right? So choosing to do something is something that we specifically do, we specifically engage in. A dead person cannot do that. A dead person can also not listen to ads.
Okay, so we talked about this arrangement here. We have the rats are in the cage, they're pressing a lever. You could say that they're choosing to press the lever instead of doing anything else, but we also know that they are in a situation where they're hungry, the lever's available, pressing the lever earns food. If we add the idea of choice in there, it doesn't actually change our understanding about this. Arguably, it makes it more confusing and makes it less easy to actually derive a comprehensive analysis. But what if we gave them two levers?
Ooh.
Now, do we have to specify that this is choice?
Okay, so in the 1960s, a scientist by the name of Richard Herrnstein, or maybe Herrnstein, either way, published studies that showed that if you teach a pigeon to peck a button that produces food, reinforcement, intermittently, which means kind of like randomly, not randomly, but like kind of randomly, not as often as one.
Yes, every once in a while.
Yeah. And then another button next to it that also produces food intermittently, but on a slightly different schedule or kind of like pattern.
Yeah.
The bird will essentially learn to peck each button at a rate that is approximately equal to how much food is available per button. So basically, simply put, they'll peck the button that produces more food more often. They'll peck the button that produces less food less often.
Yeah, they'll peck both because in most of these experiments, like they can maximize how much they can earn by pecking at both because it's at usually certain intervals. And so like as an interval is a sort of about to elapse, well, actually in this case, they're usually unpredictable intervals, but they'll essentially allocate the majority of their responses to the one that produces the most reinforcement and a proportionate less amount of responses to the one that has less reinforcement. And he summarized his finding in a mathematically quantitative formula. I guess I don't know if that's redundant to say, but he did that.
Here's the math.
Here's the math part. You're going to listen through it and you're going to ignore what I say, and that's fine because it doesn't matter. Basically, you had response 1 or behavior 1 divided by behavior 1 plus behavior 2 equals reinforcement 1 divided by reinforcement 1 plus reinforcement 2. That gives you a rate of behavior is equal to a rate of reinforcement. That's basically all the equation says.
Right.
And he found that this effect was so consistent and predictable, like Skinner had done 3 decades earlier in his career, that he dubbed it a scientific law. And the formula states that, again, as I said, the relative rate of responding from an organism, in this case, the pigeon, behavior 1 divided by behavior 1 plus behavior 2, matches the relative rate of reinforcement. Reinforcement 1 divided by reinforcement 1 plus reinforcement 2.
Sure.
That is the whole equation as it was originally conceptualized to talk about understanding the choice between these two buttons.
I think the thing that is really important to kind of pinpoint here is that this equation he is saying is a law. It is so consistent that it is a law, that it is essentially it is written to be. There's not really a lot of variation from that.
If you break the law, you go to nature jail.
I don't want to go to nature jail. It's probably full of, I don't know, scary things in the woods, and I don't like being outside.
Fair.
If you want to be really nerdy about these data points, these data that we're talking about are plotted on a logarithmic graph where the one axis is the rate of response per minute and the other axis is the rate of reinforcement per minute as a scatter plot type of analysis. So you can kind of see a scatter plot of this. And the dots align such that the rate of response increases, so too does the reinforcement in a nearly perfect straight line, which is kind of fun to see.
Eureka! We have discovered it. An analysis of behavior is so eloquent, so consistent, that it can be quantified with a simple mathematical formula and predicted with nearly surgical level precision, if it works that way.
Sure. So, of course, we know, especially when you kind of get into the muck of it, it's not that easy. For a lot of different reasons. For one thing, we can easily quantify how many responses a pigeon does, but how do we quantify how much reinforcement they receive? That is one of the questions kind of arises out of this.
You got to think about that sort of thing.
Yeah, right. At the most basic, does one food pellet mean one reinforcer? What if it varies in size or freshness? What about the pigeon becoming less hungry as it eats? What if the food fails to meet the nutritional requirements for the pigeon? Even if we don't account for those things, those specific things that we just asked, we do know that reinforcement can vary in terms of its quality, how quickly it's delivered, how much of that reinforcer is delivered itself. What if one piece of food is extra hefty or extra small? Thus, they revised their equation to accommodate the relative value of the reinforcer. So now this law has changed to include value.
Yes. Now, as we said, the rate of reinforcement, they were essentially saying like food pellet is how you quantify rate of reinforcement so that you can say it's equal to rate of response.
Sure.
But we also, as we were just saying, like, does a food pellet equal 1 though? Does it equal 1 to the pigeon? Does it change over time? Are they completely even in how they're made? Because I'd be willing to bet there's some amount of variation that may not seem like very much to you, but might seem like a lot to the pigeon.
Right.
And just things to consider. And if you consider that the general idea of the matching law is the amount of responding is equal to the amount of reinforcement, then one thing you can do is flip it and say the probability of a given response is equal to the amount of reinforcement that is available. Because basically we're saying the rate of behavior is equal to the reinforcement that's earned. And you can just then say, well, if that's true, then also the probability of a behavior is equal to the amount of reinforcement that is available. So if there's more available, there's a higher probability that behavior will be allocated toward that option.
Right. If there's more reward available, there's more behavior toward that reward. Like essentially, if there are more pink starburst, you are more likely to see responding. But if there are more orange starburst, I don't know, not so much.
For Shane and for Kimmy Schmidt.
That's my understanding, at least, of starburst. I haven't had a starburst in a very long time because I don't think they're vegetarian, so I can't have them.
I don't know. I
don't know.
It.
Anyway, this maybe I just totally discredited our entire podcast by saying that I didn't know something. But interestingly, organisms will sometimes respond more than what reinforcement is actually received. So there's going to be a higher rate of responding versus reinforcement, or they will respond less than what reinforcement is actually received. So so the rate of responding changes despite reinforcement sometimes.
Right.
This has been called overmatching or undermatching, respectively. So if I respond more, it's overmatching. If I respond less, it's undermatching. So to accommodate these trends, the equation was amended to include variables called a free parameter. And so essentially, a free parameter is a number you plug into the equation. Once the data have all been collected and analyzed, then you add in whatever numbers will make the data make sense according to that model. I know what it sounds like, but I would like Abraham to kind of take the lead on this and really tear this to shreds.
Yeah, so basically what you do is you create this equation that is supposed to describe and predict behavior. You're like, this is how behavior works. If we take this equation and look at a behavior pattern, we will be able to predict with relative certainty how that behavior will play out. Except it doesn't seem to work as well as we want it to. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take this equation, we're going to look at the behavior first, we're going to quantify what's happening in that behavior, then we're going to take those numbers, plug them into the equation, and then say, aha, our equation does work to predict that behavior. Except that it happened after the behavior took place, so it's not really predicting it. It's just describing it after it has already taken place, and then the model doesn't actually predict what it does. So yes, the free parameters in this case are just plug in whatever values into the equation, make the data do what you want the data to do according to the model you're looking at.
Right.
And that is, I'm trying to say this without being snarky, that is what it is. I mean, it's like, let me just say like a little bit differently, because as I said, they usually plot these on these logarithmic graphs to make the lines fit closely with what the models say that the lines should be doing. They just wait until they have all their data, and then they figure out what numbers would need to be plugged into the model to make the lines fit those data better. Then they have their equation afterward. So
it's the equivalent of going, and another thing.
Well, it's sort of like, I am probably going to get in trouble from somebody for saying this, but there's like this, I think it's called the bullseye logical fallacy, where it's like you shoot an arrow at something and then go draw a bullseye around it. That's like largely what has happened in this situation. Is they're like, I'm basically going to go just draw the target around my arrow and say that, look, I got a bullseye.
Right.
Yeah, you drew it after it landed. Like it's one thing to set up the target and then aim at it. It's another thing to like let the arrow just go where it's going to go and then just go draw a target wherever it landed and say like, look what I did. Like I mean, like I said, I'm sure some people are going to say I'm being disingenuous, but tell me I'm wrong. You are changing your equation to make it fit the data rather than using your equation to describe and predict the data.
Right. I mean, I think, you're talking about, and I think I could hear from like the quantitative behavior analysts out there that are going, well, an equation is supposed to be you're plugging numbers in to create kind of, or like to balance an equation, right? Like I could see like, the law of gravity being one of those things where like there's probably certain levels that you have to plug in certain specific unique variables to that context to do that, but it doesn't really seem to make sense for behavior, because at the end of the day, reinforcer qualities can't be accounted for in a mathematical equation, I think, the same way that other things can.
Well, they do certainly try to do that with that revised 1969 model. But so you're right. Like you do plug numbers into the equation to make it make sense. Now, for most of those numbers, they're in the original equation. That was just what happened. Here's the number of behaviors that occurred. They don't need to make that number up. It is just the number that happened. Here's the number of reinforcers that weren't. They don't need to make that up.
Right.
Again, assuming that they can count a pellet as one. Here's the number of reinforcers that weren't.
Sure.
Then they have these variables that say like, okay, well, the thing is now on my left side of the equation, I have this number. And on the right side of the equation, I have this number, and they do not equal each other.
Right.
And yet I have an equal sign between them. So now what I need to do is put an extra number in here, and I'm going to multiply them until they equal each other. And so those are the free parameters that they're just like, well, they don't equal each other. So I'm just going to plug in a number that's based on nothing. It's not an observation. It's not something I counted. It's just the number to change the two so that they're equal.
Right. It's the Trump map.
Yeah. Yes, that is what it is.
See, you were worried about saying something offensive and upsetting. I think I'm going to be the one that says more. I think I'm going to find the real life examples and be like, nope, it's that thing, and cause us some trouble. So
that's great. We need the real word. We need those applications. Okay, yeah. So we'll continue through here. So like Skinner before him, Herrnstein's matching equation kicked off. I mean, just an enormous amount of research and other sort of subfields and specialties of application. So if research for the sake of research is inherently good, then yay, good, did the thing.
Sure. To be charitable, I think that there are other fields who have come up with laws and theories and things that have kind of launched 1,000 studies that we've discovered new things as a result of a faulty law, or like I feel like all of psychodynamics is that, where it started with like and again, I guess we're just going to piss off everybody on this show, but I think originally coming from Freud's theories and stuff, you find that like not a lot of it holds water today, but there is some useful stuff that has come out of the research that was done over the years that started with this kind of nugget of an idea.
That's fair. Okay. I buy that. I'm good with it.
That's the charitable part. That's the charitable part that I would say. So anyway, matching law was extended to the concept of delay discounting, which researchers evaluate how the effectiveness of reinforcement decays over time, depending on how much time passes between the response and the reinforcement, kind of. So there is that piece too, which is like a fascinating line of research, but again, kind of has its roots in this matching law thing.
It also, it inspired the development of behavioral momentum theory, which evaluates how much the amount of reinforcement earned in the past is likely to affect the extent to which that behavior is likely to persist, even if reinforcement is no longer available or changes for some reason, or something else about their situation changes. So basically, a lot did come out of it. It started with this simple equation, which evolved and morphed and changed over time into a freewheeling Hydra monster, but like out of that came these other lines of research that like people's whole careers are based on like just that thing.
Right. And so in short, what's kind of come out of this is matching law states that whatever you or any organism is doing at any given moment is because there is more reinforcement for that behavior than any other alternative behavior that you might be doing. That's essentially kind of the main thesis of matching law.
There was, maybe there still is, this humorous logo that some have put on coffee mugs or on t-shirts and whatnot. And it has the matching law formula on whatever merch it's on. And underneath the formula, it says why I'm not doing something else right now. Uh-huh. And so, yeah, the joke being that like I'm doing whatever I'm doing because there's more reinforcement here than there is for other things that I could be doing. Like that's sort of what the humorous thing is supposed to be. And I get it. Like it's haha, good job, everyone. Very funny.
Haha, humor. I know. I understand human humor.
Yeah, that's right. I get your joke. Good. Uh-huh.
So, it is one of those things, though, as we start to unpack it, you start to learn that there are enough holes in it that to call it a law is unfair, I think.
It certainly would be worth actually unpacking like the difference between a law theory and a law and,
maybe that's all the
different sort of levels. Yeah. Okay, we want to stick on here. So I think generally what I wanted to do with the initial part of this is just unpack matching law, what it says, how we understand it, what it means, that sort of thing. And also I think be charitable in considering what kinds of quote unquote good things it's done. And before I do that, though, you can account for my choice to go to ads by there being reinforcement from those ads in the terms of dollars and cents. I mean, mostly cents and not very many of them, but here they are.
More cents, less dollars.
Okay, so hopefully we have some sense now. That's a pun that works on multiple levels, really.
So good.
But let's talk about some of the sort of practical applications that have come out of matching law, why people like it, what it's done for them. If you are working in some setting and you are shaping behavior or helping to develop the skills of some person, and you spent just 0 seconds thinking about how reinforcement works, even if you were explicitly trained to use reinforcement and think about it, the matching law formula and general idea is extremely useful for getting people to think about how whatever behavior a person is doing is being reinforced. And importantly, behaviors that they're not doing are not being reinforced, or at least not as much. And I do think that that is a very helpful heuristic for many people to help them guide their thinking around solving a problem, or again, helping some person develop some skills of some sort that they might have been tasked with that job.
Sure. So in part, this could mean that people are more likely to try and leverage positive reinforcement to help guide behavior more so than more aversive alternatives, which I think is a good general rule that we probably want to follow, like reinforce behavior, that we want to see and all that stuff. So another part of this is that it could mean that people are compassionate to the fact that whatever the person they are serving is or isn't doing is influenced by whatever their reinforcement history is. So there's another layer to that we have to unpack a little bit.
And I think, with the values of human beings and humanists, those are good things. Like we're happy with the fact that we're thinking about this from a more compassionate standpoint. Another extension is considering that if someone has an extensive history of reinforcement for some pattern that is, for whatever reason, problematic for them and or others, then it will be harder to coach a change in that behavior and expect the change to be slow. The whole "you can't teach an old dog new tricks" adage. You can, it just often takes longer.
It's undoing some things, redoing some things. It's a lot of rearrangement.
Yes.
Also, behaviorists rarely relied on statistical analyses for their data in the past, which greatly confused other psychologists, scientists, and lay people. It confuses everyone. I mean, the thing that's funny about that is that we don't use a lot of statistical analyses, and that confuses people.
Yes.
But statistical analyses confuse everybody. So you're confused why we don't use the confusing thing. Okay. I just wanted to make sure we got that. But then the matching law and others come along with mathematical formulas to describe behavior, and now behavior science can be taken seriously, according to some folks. Now, that is, matching law gave behaviorism a lot of street cred with other psychologists.
Yeah, and like other fields generally.
Yeah.
And the other thing about matching law is it also illuminated for many how and why people make the choices that they make. There is more reinforcement, or at least a greater history of reinforcement for certain choices that they make, or similar or sort of related choices. So that just demystifies the nature of some of what people do. For some people, is just thinking about it in that way. So
sure.
I think, again, that creates the opportunity for some compassion, for some perspective taking, some sort of understanding, and sort of where other people are coming from. And I think that, again, that is generally something I would think of as being good when we're thinking of our sort of values and science and that sort of thing.
Sure. So with all that being said, we're going to get to the actual criticisms now. If we weren't critical enough as we have gone through this, let's start with a little bit of the mathematical criticisms that go along with this. Now, matching law inspired behavior momentum theory, and although it did, matching law itself does not account for a history of reinforcement. So it accounts for what we would describe as current or maybe like contextual reinforcement in that moment, but lacks any sort of analysis of the history. In fact, The matching law essentially predicts that if reinforcement stops, the behavior will stop, which we know is not true.
Yeah, and in our third story that we started with, there was this person who was gambling and losing all of their money. They played but lost and lost and lost money. Why did they continue the behavior if reinforcement was not forthcoming? Well, because behavior does not necessarily, or almost ever, stop immediately if reinforcement stops. Just a quick example. If you go into a room and it's dark and you flip a light switch, the light turns on. Presumably, the light coming on is a reinforcer for tapping the light switch, right?
Right.
If you go into a room and turn on a dark room and you hit the light switch and the light does not come on, most people hit it like 4 more times.
Sure.
Or like a bunch more times. 4. I just came up with the number 4 totally arbitrarily. So essentially, behavior does happen when reinforcement stops, and even when it has been reinforced every single time and not intermittently, like you can expect that sort of thing. So in addition to the fact that matching law repeatedly failed to adequately capture actual behavior, even in ideal circumstances, remember we talked about overmatching and undermatching, and also reinforcement quality and the value differences in reinforcers, and the need for free parameters. It also didn't adequately describe if reinforcement stops suddenly. So it really wasn't doing a very thorough job in sort of predicting and understanding behavior contextually situated.
Sure. So obviously, for those of us who are conservative about our data analyses, the need to employ free parameters to post hoc solve a problem that the equation can't handle is unsatisfactory, to say the least. Like, it doesn't, I don't feel good about going, oh, my equation was wrong. Let me add this thing to fix my equation so that my equation is now right. Like, that doesn't feel
the data.
good. Yeah. That's the thing that, like, I as a clinician just don't feel good about. Like, I wouldn't go do that with my client's data. So, like, why would I feel good about doing that in research? Now, some of the commonly stated goals of science are to describe, predict, and influence variables. That's a bit, so description, prediction, control. So a huge part of our work. Most of these quantitative models stop at prediction, but the use of free parameters means that they aren't even doing that. They are just describing. And to be fair, matching law isn't even the most offensive of these things. Some have several free parameters all over the place, as if the equation is really more of a gentle suggestion or nudge in the right direction.
Yeah.
So we kind of run in this issue where it's like, the more free parameters you add, the less, I guess, accurate that becomes, or the less authentic it becomes, it seems like to me.
I mean, the less describing the model is doing in terms of sort of understanding what's taking place in the behavior. I mean, it's already failed to be predictive, and now it's at the point where it's barely descriptive also. I'm like, what?
Right.
What's your goal here? To just write down a bunch of numbers? Because you can just do that. You don't have to pretend it's like a thing.
Right.
Okay, so we're doing some criticisms here of matching law, and this next one is not really an important criticism of matching law itself, but it is worth, we would be remiss if we didn't mention and point out that Herrnstein, the author of the matching law, who's presumably sort of it kicked off all the quantitative study of behavior, at least in the way that it has turned out to be. He co-authored a book in 1994 called The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. That was my best sort of news anchor reading of that.
That was really good. I like that.
Thanks. And in this book, the authors make many controversial claims, not least among them is the idea that race and intelligence are linked, assuming, of course, that in this book, the way that they put it, white people are genetically superior and therefore gifted with superior intelligence. We have done a several-part episode on intelligence. Obviously, this is a very racist idea, and we espouse an anti-racist position on things.
Yes.
And Stephen Jay Gould responded with a just masterclass in absolutely dismantling their entire discussion. He did it mathematically, he did it conceptually, and this really good book everyone should read called The Mismeasure of Man. He basically just took on their whole thesis and just destroyed it. He just took the whole thing completely apart, and I think did so beautifully. It's a strong recommend. I do think for most people, if you do choose to read this book, you're going to want to have a dictionary with you. Stephen Jay Gould had a, if I may say so, fecund vocabulary.
Sure. Speaking of vocabulary, what does that word mean?
Vocabulary.
Yeah, that's fair. I sort of set that one up. So fecund essentially or fecund, I've heard it also said, essentially just refers to a wealth of something, an abundance of something. Fecundity is like an abundance. Like if you were looking at nature, they often describe nature as being fecund when it produces a lot. You have new growth, new offspring, that sort of thing. So he has a rich, productive vocabulary, I guess.
Okay. That's fair. So I think even moving, like taking out the horrible racist stuff, like obviously that's a bad thing, but looking directly at this guy's math, this is 2 times where his math has been not really great. Right. So like we've kind of showed that matching law is like kind of we're massaging data a little bit. We've showed that like the bell curve stuff, like it's been destroyed entirely. So this guy is 0 for 2 when it comes to mathematical models.
Several people would strongly disagree with that statement, but that's okay. I think it does depend on how you measure it, which is kind of the crux of what we're talking about here, really. So
yeah. So let's take a second to consider what matching law offered behaviorism. Okay, so in the original animal experiments, Skinner and future researchers were able to assemble a comprehensive philosophy of behavior from simple reactions to complex cognitive mechanisms. So there's a lot of stuff kind of as we're starting to unpack that. They observed that an animal in a box can be taught to press a button or lever or whatever, pull a chain, there's all kinds of things there, could learn conditional associations such as different colors or sequence of lights that signal reinforcement, to learn to combine behaviors to accomplish complex tasks, could learn to demonstrate a concept of self according to common infant experiments, etc., etc., etc. So in behaviorism, there are all these really complex experiments that kind of break down behavior at its core and really show that animals can do a whole lot of really complex things.
End up being applied to humans as well, and understanding a huge amount of the complexity in human behavior.
Right.
Using, again, all building off of that framework. And so going back to these experiments that Skinner performed, why does the animal press the lever or button? as we said, because of its motivation, it was hungry, or there was some other motivating arrangement. Sometimes they made it really hot or really cold, and there could be a change in temperature. And the signals indicated that food or whatever reinforcement was available. And Skinner often marveled at the, quote, special kind of orderliness in a smooth curve, end quote, that the data that they obtained in their experiments could produce. There's just very systematic, orderly data that always, like, they were so consistent and observable that you could reliably predict what they were doing. Not described via mathematical equation. It was just, here are what the data, like he arranged a pretty simple, but I think ingenious way of measuring it, where essentially it was, he called it a cumulative recorder, meaning that every response, every time that they pressed a lever or pressed a button, it would just tick up on this little sheet of paper that was scrolling continuously. And once it reached the top, it would like go back down so it could continue ticking up. And that way you could see these really clear curves in the data that just are what they were. I mean, you could certainly quantify those mathematically if you wanted to, but you could also just look at the data and see the trends that were emerging that were very clear, and you could show how you could manipulate variables to affect those trends.
Sure. And so of course, what we started discovering was that the animals press the lever or buttons in consistent, predictable patterns. We understood this immediately, okay, that and that's the only reason that science of behavior was able to form in the first place, is because we were able to see that right away. So said another way, what Skinner and colleagues observed, recorded, and published was that behavior occurred when reinforcement was available. Okay, what was added by suddenly discovering that behavior occurred when reinforcement was available in the matching law? There have been some practical applications since, but conceptually, we would argue very little, if anything. It repackaged something that was so implicitly and explicitly baked into the philosophy and discoveries of our science that it would be like if I suddenly discovered that a vacuum could be conceptualized as a lack of matter. I guess the more we're doing this episode, I just am not buying it. You know what I mean? I'm just kind of like, why are we even still talking about matching law at this point in time? It's clear this doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay. So that is us sort of unpacking a lot of the sort of criticisms of matching law. And we haven't talked very much about like choice and the idea of choice. I think it's inherently wrapped up in this idea of you're choosing between two alternatives. It could be that there's only one clear choice and there's a lot of other things that you could be doing that are unclear. There could be many alternatives that are all relatively equally weighted, whatever. So they're talking about this idea of choice. So let's talk about choice. If we generally understand how behavior works without matching law, and we do, then we are faced with a dilemma about the concept of choice. Virtually everything you do is a choice between what you did end up doing and what you didn't end up doing, right?
Sure.
As we move through the world and do things, we do so because what is available around us, what we have learned up to that point, how much reinforcement and punishment is available for certain behaviors, how we are doing biologically, that is, if we're sick, hungry, tired, energetic, alert, healthy, whatever language or cognition we're doing in that circumstance. Is everything we do that, or is it choosing every action over every other action that we could be taking? Could it even be both of those things? Do we need both of those things?
Yeah.
Like, so little, if anything, was added by conceptualizing behavior in this way. And so much confusion and misunderstanding can be introduced. I honestly think the nicest thing that I could say about this and matching law is that it feels superfluous. It seems unnecessary.
Yeah, the more we kind of get into it, and I'm starting to think that like maybe part of the problem is that they've conflated choice and options. Like I feel like that's something we can kind of maybe unpack, because I think choice in itself is a behavior, but options are like the antecedent conditions in which you could, behavior is selected based on available options or availability. And again, it still ultimately comes down to availability, right?
I like this idea of parsing choice from options. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, because I think that's ultimately that's kind of where I keep landing, is I'm like, well, choice, I make choices, but I make choices and engage in behavior based on available options. And so availability and options seem to me like a simpler way to understand this. But there's more. So if someone is presented with two clear options and chooses one of them, why do they make that choice? They're going to make that choice because of what was available and around, what they have learned up to that point, how much reinforcement or punishment is available for that behavior, how they're doing biologically, and whatever language cognition we are engaging in that circumstance. So they are going to choose the thing that makes the most sense to them in that specific moment. And in that case, was the option that they didn't pick really even a choice if they were going to select the option that they did, which leads to another point,
Yes. And honestly, one of the most foundational points in the whole discussion we have today, and that's a great cliffhanger to leave us on before we have to do some ads. As you just said, if we sort of are understanding that all of these confluence of variables that came together that ended up resulting in someone engaging in one set of options, there was multiple things that were available. They went a particular route. We can kind of unpack the reinforcement history and all of their circumstances, and we probably could understand and even maybe predict the option that they went with. If that is the case, and the other option kind of isn't really necessarily a choice for them because of that confluence in variables, then the concept of choice doesn't really make sense in a basic understanding of the universe, generally speaking.
Right.
So Hayes, Adams, and Ryden in 1994 point out the paradox of choice. And I believe we've used this quote before, but I'm going to keep using it because I love it so much.
Yeah.
And so they what they say is, quote, the concept of choice assumes that any number of alternative courses of action are possible at any moment. And inasmuch as only one action actually occurs at any given moment, an appeal is made to the evidence of what might have been. Choice implies that something other than what did happen could have happened, as though what did happen were not the culmination of history. As argued in Hayes' 1988, page 25, this is a quote within a quote now, so quote turducken, quote, we cannot speak of what might have been when confronting what is, because what is a point in the evolution of what has been. Had it been otherwise, it would have been otherwise, but it is not otherwise. It is as it is. End quote. End quote.
That it sounds wild when you say it like that, but it makes sense when you really drill down into it.
Yeah, essentially every action that happens, and honestly, everything in the universe that happens, like it happened in the production of its circumstances. There were variables that pushed it that way, one way or whatever way it went, right? If the circumstances had been different, the choice would have been different. The effect would have been different. The outcome would have been different. But the circumstances led up to the fact that at that juncture in time, when those variables collided, that was the direction they were going to go. Like, I think about this a lot because I love to play games of like when you roll a die or dice, you essentially are trying to introduce an element of luck and randomness. But the orientation of the dice when it leaves your hand, how far it is until it hits the thing that is going to roll on, the shape of the dice, how fast it's moving, the ambient like air atmosphere in the room you're in, those are all variables that will affect what it lands on. It does not actually land randomly. It lands according to the laws of nature and physics. And like we can't predict them well enough to know, so it feels random enough to use it for things like for games, you know.
Right.
And that's great. I'm perfectly good with that. But the same general logic applies to understanding human behavior. Like it still follows all of the things that we know about behavior. It is shaped through the world just like evolution, just like physics, in that it is driven by its circumstances and environment up to the point where a thing, like if you want to conceptualize the environmental arrangement of options, it was going to go one of those directions.
Right. That makes total sense. So I think as we go forward, it's important to point out, so Hazel will further elaborate on this, that this does not mean that we, or any scientist really, believe that everything is predetermined, destined, or unavoidable. It's just that we reached the juncture at which the choice occurred. It happened in a way that made the most sense at that moment, given its historical context. And I think that's really, really important. The choice that was made in that context, the reason it was made is because everything that happened before it.
Right. Yes. And I would love to have a conversation at some point about what stochasticity and randomness really mean. And I kind of alluded to all of that just now, and how it applies to the psychology of human behavior. But we'll save that for another day. Arguably, we've unpacked it enough here that we don't need to save it for another day. In our last episode that we released, we were talking about stochasticity. So if you haven't heard that, our guest on that episode, Joseph Daly, does a really nice job unpacking that term. And so you can go check that out there. But you could think of it as, roughly as randomness.
Sure.
It is a interesting philosophical sort of debate to get into.
Yeah. With all that being said, if we can account for the variables that lead to a choice being made, and we often cannot because we don't know them all, then we can understand why the behavior happened the way it did. We don't need an equation to do that. We don't need laws and rule. Like we kind of already have an understanding of general rules that lead to that space. A history of learning, history of reinforcement, availability, all of those things. We have a good enough idea of general rules to lead to that space without creating a really complicated and unnecessary equation.
Okay, and you kind of set me up for this. We also don't need the concepts of ghosts, wizards, or magic superimposed on behavior for it to make sense if the objective variables we are aware of can adequately describe behavior. Choice is kind of a magic wizard ghost that's just extra in our understanding of behavior. We gain as much by saying that all behavior is a plan. And no one in our field says that because we don't need it. It doesn't add anything. I could try and say, like, I'm discovering that whenever you did something, you planned to do it. But what would that tell us anything different about behavior than what we already understand? All it would do is introduce confusion and an extra variable that we now need to try and wrap our heads around that would not have in any way changed our analysis of that behavior as it occurred. So we don't need to superimpose these variables into our understanding because the variables that we already know about, even if we can't account for them, they are all of them anyway. They are sufficient to understand behavior, and we don't need to introduce new ones that we can't observe, that are only hypothetical, and that do not adequately add anything to the conversation.
Even more simply put, I don't think that matching law is as parsimonious as our understanding of the simple principles of behavior.
Oh, beautiful.
And I think that really is ultimately what I land on with that, is that I think it's an extra step to discover the same thing.
Yes, Shane.
I think what we're describing is behavior is better explained through what we described before: antecedents, motivations, consequences, history of learning, options and discrimination training and conditional discriminations. All of those things are better explanatory ways of looking at behavior than going, oh, this thing of choice, this matching law thing is really kind of, it's like you said, superfluous. It's not parsimonious. We have better ways of explaining it already.
That was lovely.
Hey, thanks.
Okay. There are some critical misunderstandings that may arise from someone listening to this, hearing my passion, hearing our discussion, and we want to make sure that we sort of clear these up before we walk away from this and wipe our hands and say, all right, we did the thing, we're done. The first one is we are not advocating that people and animals should not be given choices. In fact, we would state the opposite. Often giving someone a choice helps tell you what their reinforcers are when you don't know, and we often don't know. So you just give them a choice, and then they get to sort of choose a thing. That you give them options, they select a thing, and you did not know what they were going to select because you didn't have their history ahead of time, and now you have a better idea of kind of what their reinforcers are, and you can then leverage that positive reinforcement to help guide them in whatever skills they're trying to develop. It may help whoever you're working with, person or animal or otherwise, feel a sense of control, which is a kind, compassionate thing to do. What control is, we don't need to get into at the moment. The point is we can experience the feeling of autonomy, and many of us, if not all of us, will generally seek out a sense of autonomy in most of our general interactions. And honestly, sometimes the choice is all that is needed to help someone feel safe and open to feedback and that kind of guidance. Is that they were maybe very resistant to you trying to steer them in a different direction, and once they have choices, then they're like, okay, I feel like I get to have a say in this. I can participate more meaningfully, and they're less likely to be resistant to that kind of attempts at guidance, if you will.
Right, absolutely. A second point that we would make is that arguing against the idea of choosing does not mean that we think people should not be held accountable for the bad things they have done. So, and you kind of talked about this earlier. For one thing, the circumstances, most of which we don't know, were present that led to them doing whatever horrible thing they did, and either still are present or may quickly become present again. So they may be a danger to others if not held accountable for their actions, even if we can understand why those actions unfolded the way they did. And I think it's also important too, if we don't hold them accountable or alter the circumstances that led there, then we're going to run into the same issue multiple times, right? So when someone drives drunk and causes an accident, they are in more trouble than if they drove sober and caused an accident. They are in less trouble if they suffered a medical emergency while driving and caused an accident. And so you see that the circumstances change despite the fact that the response And the reward/punishment are like could be the same according to some of these equations.
Looking at the choice of drunk driving being why driving drunk was considered a more highly punishable offense, even if the outcome was about the same. I was thinking about this. Many people do other bad things when they're drunk, and sometimes they'll even drink to have an excuse for doing the bad things that they did. And some people will even excuse their behavior saying, oh, well, they were just drunk. And I've always been a little bit confused thinking, why does it make sense to do something else wrong while drunk is like, okay, then, or at least it's worse than driving while drunk, which we have all sort of universally acknowledged as bad. Just food for thought, just a thing to think about. It's like you do a bad thing when you're drunk and it's like, oh, well, they were just drunk, versus you drive drunk and you're like, oh, you are going to jail for a very long time because you drove drunk.
Right.
I'm like, in both of these circumstances, they did the bad thing first, which was they got drunk, and then they did another bad thing, which they probably wouldn't have done if they hadn't been drunk. So consider.
It's interesting. Yeah. Now, I think the last point we'd make underneath this is that with respect to matching law specifically, despite some significant limitations, the matching law is not wrong. In fact, it is correct almost by definition. Further, it has helped a lot of people in a lot of different ways. Largely, we are arguing that it was not an advance on the philosophy we already had. And maybe it was never meant to be that. It's certainly attracted a lot of talented people to do some good science. So it probably has a net good. We're not saying that at the end of the day, matching law is this terrible thing. We're just saying it's gilding the lily, essentially.
There you go. Yeah. And like, I wanted to essentially use this episode to unpack and describe matching law, because I feel like a lot of people have maybe heard of it, but they're not really sure what it is. Maybe they're like, they heard of it and they're like, oh, I want to go learn all about that thing now. And maybe that this episode will inspire them to do that. There's certainly going to be people who listen to me say anything and say, I want to go prove that guy wrong. And I say, more power to you.
Please do.
I honestly, I would like for someone to try and come in here and tell me where I've gotten this wrong, because I've talked with people about this. I've thought about this a lot. I've read a lot about this, and I just keep walking away with, I feel like, as you said, it's not as parsimonious as the science we started with and the science that we still have, and so I think that it at best, most of the time, I feel like that's unnecessary. But again, I don't want to ignore the fact that it has inspired a lot of people to do some really good research. And like, pragmatically, that also, I think, is a good in and of itself. So like, if I look at the utility of this for the outcome, not from the model itself, but from the people that it has touched and inspired, then it's hard for me to want to be mad at it at all, because it has had some really good effects. And I also don't think that many people, if any, have used it deleteriously. I don't think it has been used for harm. Those are things I think to just consider in terms of saying, like, as you said, matching law is not bad. It's not wrong. We don't hate it. I just feel like I wanted to do a little bit of unpacking on what it is, what it means, how it works, and why I don't think it adds very much to the science that I know and love.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And I think there's a point that you made that I really want to kind of go back to. When you talk about the tenets of science and you talk about things like determinism, parsimony, pragmatism, and all that stuff, I think where it lacks in parsimony, it makes up for in pragmatism. I think that your point is where, like, fair. Like, it may not be the most parsimonious thing, but ultimately it has led to so much good research that has resulted in a lot of good clinical work that I think it's okay that it's not quite as parsimonious. I think that we got to stop pretending, though, that it's more important than it is.
I think that's fair. Yeah, we take it off its pedestal, put it down, like,
put it where it deserves to be.
Yeah, put it on the floor next to something where it's like, well, we don't want to forget that it's there. We can use it whenever we need to, but it can come down off its pedestal where we're pretending that it's really valuable. It's fine. It's there. People like it. Good.
Yeah, we don't want to get rid of it.
No,
we just want to call it what it is.
Yeah. Let's just be a little realistic there. We can sort of say some take-home points. I think that first, we should probably let the advertisers do their thing.
Boo.
The take-home points I think that we have don't necessarily add a lot to the conversation, but just sort of get through them really quick. I think I want to summarize sort of the big themes I felt like were sort of in this discussion. And one is, as I said, is that there's been so much research and discussion from smarter people than us on choice and matching law. This was really just the briefest of overviews on that topic. So definitely go read more about it if you're interested. That's kind of like my first thing to say is a lot of people have said a lot about this. I do think that we brought some discussion to the table that I've been desperately wanting somebody else to bring
for
to the
years,
table.
Yeah.
And
you've been wanting to do this for some time.
Very little. Yeah. I've just heard and read so little from people who are interested in sort of taking this to task. And so I'm trying my hand at it. Hopefully I did okay. But I like I said, go read up on that literature. There is a lot of it. So if you're interested in this, you have your work cut out for you. But if you love your job, you never work a day in your life. If you have fun reading this kind of research, like you will certainly enjoy the wealth that is abundant and available to you.
Yeah, I thought you did a good job with this. It was fun.
Thank you.
So another point is the matching law's mathematical equation called a quantitative model that numerically describes the observation that behavior occurs lawfully with respect to the available reinforcement. Oh, that's a hell of a sentence.
Thank you.
It has launched thousands of careers and tens of thousands of articles and attracted a lot of brilliant people to our science. We also think it adds little to our understanding of behavior in juxtaposition to the work that has already been done. And that's just kind of our ultimate stance that we land on here.
I'll also say, just as a quick take-home point, choice is a conceptually useless idea that often obfuscates an understanding of behavior.
Sure.
And it is also a humbling and important strategy for helping the people that we work with and for feel safe and understood. We should be searching ways to give people more choice in general, not necessarily more choices. A lot of choices can be very overwhelming and unpleasant, but more choice in general, more choice than less choice. Like being stuck between two crappy presidential candidates that almost nobody wants either one of. Yeah. We just want more choice, you know?
Yeah. We want better choices, more quality choices.
Yes, better choices, exactly. Okay, but I think that's what we have to say on the matching law and choice. I was afraid to do this one. It's one that, as you said, I've been wanting to do for a long time. I hope I did it justice. I'm sure I angered some people. Please write in, let us know. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. We have a couple of recommendations to give to you. We have a listener mail I'm excited to read. Ooh. And I also need to sort of get through the credits first. So I'm gonna do that really quick. First, if you would like to support the show, if you agreed with what I said today, and even if you don't, consider joining us on Patreon, where you can get access to extra behind-the-scenes content and bonus goodies and all that sort of thing. And you will also have my gratitude, and I will read your name out and a list of people who have made the generous gift of joining us in their donations, which includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you guys so much. We are just very grateful for you and all that you have done for us.
Y'all are so great.
Yes. In addition, you can leave us a rating and review where you can make sure you subscribe. Go out and tell a friend about us. You can go to our website where you can pick up some merch. You can check out some old episodes. We're not totally caught up on getting the new ones up yet. As a matter of fact, we're nearly a year behind, but they're old episodes there. I will get them published at some point. And there's like other stuff you can check out on the website as well. So, you know, it's not a totally useless domain right there. I think that's it for ways that you can support us. If you'd like to tell us your thoughts on matching law or anything that we got right or wrong about this or any other episode we have ever done, feel free to email us directly. We look forward to hearing from people. You can email us at info@wwd.podcast.com. Again, in case you don't want to hit that back 15 seconds button, that was info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media sites. Speaking of which, if you do that, you will be speaking with our wonderful Emma Wilson, who is our social media coordinator, who will get those messages to us. And of course, thank you so much to my team of people who help make this happen. Justin is our audio production and engineer, mixing sound guru guy. And then Shane and I write and fact check these episodes to the best of our abilities.
Yay!
Is there anything that I missed or anything you would like to add before we get to our listener mail and recommendations?
I think that covers that part.
Groovy. Well, let's start with some listener mail. This email comes in response to our 3 meals per day episode. This is from a listener, Celeste, who I believe has written us before. Celeste writes, "Hey, Abraham and Shane, after listening to your episode 3 meals per day, I wanted to share my experience with dinner versus supper usage."
Yay! It's yes! I'm so glad we're getting an answer on this.
Yes. I live in South Louisiana, and my grandparents and their peers refer to lunch as dinner. and the last meal of the day as supper. When I was growing up, hearing my grandma ask me what I wanted for dinner at 10 a.m. confused me. Interestingly, I remember my grandma making more elaborate meals for lunch, dinner. She and my grandpa would usually eat very light suppers. Thanks for making my weeks more educational. Happy 2024.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I'd never heard that before. And obviously I'm not from the South. I'm not from Louisiana. I've spent very little time there, but I thought that was cool.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I've heard culturally that in some places, like, lunch is the big meal. We talked about it on the show too.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that there is a little bit of confirmation from the world that is not our own little echo chamber here. So that was great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Celeste, for writing in. That was really helpful. And I was excited to hear it. And I appreciate your weighing in on this. If other people, if you would like to be as cool as Celeste is, then you can write in. And it's very possible we will read your message. Unless you're advocating something about Nazis or you're just trying to get us to push your product, in which case, unlikely to receive much in the way of correspondence from us. But if you have something cool to say like Celeste, then please write in. We'd like hearing from you. And Celeste, write in again.
Yeah, I love it.
Let's get to some recommendations.
Recommendations.
All right, so I watched a movie recently, and this is a movie that I have surprisingly never seen, given the field that we work in, my interest outside of this stuff, and my love for movies.
Yeah. And horror movies at that.
And horror movies. This is a movie I should have seen many, many years ago. And I've seen parts of it, but apparently I never watched it in full. So that movie is called The Silence of the Lambs.
Ooh.
I would like to just talk for a second about how incredible all of the performances are in this movie.
Yeah.
The thing is everybody talks about Anthony Hopkins as Dr. Hannibal Lecter, as like the scary villain guy, but literally every person in this movie is incredible. Jodie Foster is at her best in this movie.
Yeah.
Like, she plays a green FBI agent, and you see her like nervousness throughout it. You see her unsure, kind of like, am I supposed to be doing this? You see her making like really risky decisions and it paying off. Like, there's so many great performances in this movie. It's absurd. And there's so many people in it too that you don't realize. Like, when you go back to watch it, you're like, I know that person, and I've seen that person, and I've seen that person. There's so many people. I think it's a perfect movie.
And Ted Levine, absolutely incredible in this role. And it's wild to see him in later roles in his career and just how incredibly different he is. Like,
yes.
Really showing that he has got amazing range.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've heard people say that a movie is only as good as its villain, and that is he is definitely a part of what makes this movie absolutely so phenomenally good.
100%. Yes, it is. I mean, and you know, you might be listening to the show and going, okay, Shane, you should catch up on the times. Like, this is movies from like 1991. It's like, yeah, but I didn't start watching horror movies until I was like 15 because I was scared of them. But I missed this one. I was like, I just never, and it's less horror and more thriller, but it's still very, 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 very good. So
yeah, I mean, it's a well done movie, and I think it almost defies genres in that way, which is fine.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a good movie. So if you're into good movies that have the element of tension and some amount of scare, then this is for you.
Absolutely.
I totally second that. I'm recommending, again, a board game. This is one I got recently. I looked up some videos from people who play this game to help get pronunciation guides on the name, because it is a little unclear, and they said it all differently. So I'm going to say it all the ways that I heard it. It is called Arborea or Arborea, maybe Arborea. It's not a game totally about plants, as one might think, or about trees specifically, but the art on this game is absolutely incredible. It is really surreal in a way. What I like about the game that's very unique is it has these pieces of the board. So you have your little pawns that go out on the board, and then the pieces move on the board, and that changes what your options are. And so it's like the board, there's like a piece of board that sits on top of the board, and that moves. And as it moves, your options for what things that you can do change. And other people might move the piece that you're on. You'll move the piece that you're on that might have other people on it. And so then that opens up kind of what things they can do. And that's one of the things that was really cool about it. But it's also it's a beautiful game. It's a relatively simple game. You just sort of go through collecting resources that you spend on things to get points, like most other games. But as I said, it has that unique feature of sort of moving the board around. That's kind of neat. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful game as well.
I love it. It does look really cool. It's got a similar art style to like a little bit of what you see in Cult of the Lamb, the video game that came out. It's like it got kind of like the cute, like interesting chibi characters, but like a little bit different, like a little bit more surreal looking. So like it's kind of cool.
I'm unfamiliar with that one, but yes, the surrealness I think is one I can get on board with. And so so that was Arborea from Alley Cat Games, and then The Silence of the Lambs, the movie, as the recommendations. Perfect.
Yes.
All right. I think that I said all the things. Is there anything that you would like to add, or anything that I forgot before we wrap up today?
No, I think we covered quite a bit.
I think we did. Well, then, thank you so much for recording with me today, Shane. Thank you, audience, for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.